Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, a number of us have real concerns about fragile states and about the arc from troubled states, states with internal conflict, to really fragile states to failed states, and what the consequences are. State is one that really has a legitimacy problem. The central government doesn't really control the whole country. It's got some insurgencies. It's got real disconnections between its average citizen and very weak state capacity, but it's not yet a completely failed state. Tell me, why should the average American care about fragile states, and how do they affect our national security? And just name a couple states you consider fragile, if you would. And then I want to talk about UN platforms to address and deal with fragile states.
Well, Americans should always be concerned about fragile states, and it's because usually when states are fragile, they start to erupt in things that can cause threats down the road. And I think if you look at South Sudan, that's a perfect example that while we have tried to bring peace to that area, you've now got a government that is not wanting that. We're starting to see other issues that are starting to happen in that area. And so it's important for us to work towards peace everywhere. And I think it's important for us to get in front of the situation. We can see before it gets fragile. We can see conflict before it happens. And it's important that I think the UN not acknowledge it once it's too late, that we start to acknowledge it as we see it's happening, because I think we can get more effectiveness done that way than otherwise.
Sort of the archetypal fragile state in this era has been Afghanistan, which was a refuge for a terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda, that attacked us, largely because it really wasn't a coherent or effective state. I'd argue that the UN offers some of the strongest tools we have to address fragile states without deploying American troops. And whether it's UNICEF, which does great work in terms of dealing with human suffering, or it's UNHCR, which deals with refugees, or it's UN peacekeeping. Talk to me about how you would imagine advocating for the UN being a more effective platform for addressing fragile states in the interest of our security and values.
I think it's important that we look for results. You know, it should not just be that we have a conversation about how a state is becoming more fragile. It's actually looking at results. And anytime we're dealing with any situation that could start to pose a threat, we need to decide what we want to do as a plan and where we want to go and what we will consider success. And I think there need to be measurables along the way to make sure that we're complying with that. And I think that those conversations need to be more detailed in nature, as opposed to more high-reaching, saying that it is fragile or it may cause problems or it may be an issue. I think we need to get more involved.
Let me ask you a closing question, if I might, that Mr. Tillerson and I went back and forth on, and several others did as well. Some view our values, and I will just give three examples, things that we fight for in the world that, frankly, the Chinese and the Russians don't: press freedom and transparency, human rights, and democracy. I see those as essential to our interests, not distinct from our interests. In one exchange, Mr. Tillerson suggested that at times, our national security interests have to take a front seat, and we maybe have to, with some of our allies and partners, have our advocacy for our values take a back seat. And I'd argue there are other settings where it is our failure to consistently advocate for democracy and human rights and good governance that leads to failed states in some cases. What's your view about the value of continuously advocating for democracy and human rights and a free press? Is it in conflict with our interests, or does it complement our interests?
I think we always talk about the values of America. I think we always talk about why we're the greatest country in the world, and I think that we always express why we want to share those values with the rest of the world. When it comes to other issues, and I understand we can have more pressing issues that we want to negotiate, I don't think we have to compromise our values to do that. I think these are conversations that can take place at the same time. I think it's very important that countries around the world know what we value, but they also know where we stand. And I think that we can have negotiations, conversations on issues that are at hand without ever compromising us talking about our values. I think both can be done at the same time.
I think we'll have a productive conversation about how we keep those in the right balance going forward, and how we invest appropriately in advancing democracy and governance and human rights and a free press at the same time that we advance our commercial or security or other interests as well. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you very much.